The wagon that brought Eli Corrigan into Bitterroot Valley carried less than most families owned in a single trunk. A change of clothes, a rusted axe head without its handle, a Bible with a broken spine, and $7 silver, which was all that remained after 2 years of failed farming in Missouri and a wife's grave he'd had to pay to dig. He arrived on the last day of the autumn trading, when the good families of the valley were laying in their winter stores, tar paper by the roll, sacks of feed corn, iron stoves freighted in from the railhead 60 miles east. Eli walked the row of wagons with his $7 held tight in his fist, and by the time he reached the far end, where a dead trapper's estate was being sold off in a heap nobody wanted, there was nothing left to buy but a mildewed crate of old wool blankets. 41 of them, gray with age, matted in places, smelling of tallow and wood smoke, and something older that no one could name. The auctioneer wanted them gone before the frost made the ground too hard to bury the trapper properly, and he let the whole crate go for $7 even. Hollis Radnor, who ran 300 head of cattle on the good bottomland and had never once in his life spent a dollar foolishly, watched the transaction from the seat of his own wagon, which was loaded with tar paper and new nails and a cast-iron stove with a shine still on it. "You'll freeze," Hollis said, not unkindly, the way a man states a fact about weather. "Blankets don't build a wall, Corrigan. A man needs boards and paper and iron, not rags." Eli said nothing. He had learned, in the 2 years since his wife died, that a man with $7 did not owe explanations to a man with 300 cattle. He loaded the crate onto his wagon and drove the 11 miles to the quarter section he'd claimed at the valley's north end, where the cabin he'd built with his own hands in 6 weeks of June and July had walls of green cottonwood logs that had already begun to shrink and gap as they dried. That first night, wind came through the gaps in his walls the way water comes through a torn net, everywhere at once, impossible to stop with a hand held over any single hole. He lay on his cot and counted the places he could see starlight and lost count somewhere past 20. It was 3 nights later, going through the crate for a blanket to nail over the worst gap by the door, that his hand found the notebook. It had been wrapped inside the innermost blanket, bound in oilcloth gone brittle at the folds, and the trapper, a man named Anders Voss, dead of a fever the summer past, who had come from some cold country across the ocean before he ever came to Montana, had filled it front to back in a careful, cramped hand that mixed English with words Eli didn't recognize. Most of it was trapping, lines, sets, the habits of beaver and marten. But 11 pages near the back were something else entirely, notes on wool. How his mother had done it in the old country, in a village where the winters buried the houses to the eaves, and there was no tar paper to be had at any price, because tar paper did not exist there and would not have helped if it had. Wool does not turn to ice water in the fibers the way cotton or linen does, Voss had written. Wet wool holds 3/4 of its warmth even soaked through, for the crimp in the fiber traps air the water cannot fully drive out. A man who does not know this freezes in wet wool and dies believing wool has failed him. It has not failed him. He has failed to understand it. Below that, in smaller letters, as though added later, teased and carded loose, then packed tight between 2 skins of cloth or bark, wool insulates a wall better than anything that grows on this side of the mountains, so long as it is kept from settling and from mice. My mother's house had walls 4 fingers thick with it, and we never burned more than 1.5 cords of wood in a winter that killed cattle standing in the open fields. Eli read those 11 pages 3 times that night by the light of a tallow candle, and by the time the candle guttered out he had stopped hearing the wind as an enemy and started hearing it as a problem with a shape. He began the next morning, before first light, with no idea what he was doing beyond what the dead man's hand had told him. His first attempt was a disaster of the ordinary, correctable kind. He tore the wool from 4 of the worst blankets and stuffed it loose and unwashed into the gaps between his logs, thinking more was simply better, and packed a wall section 8 feet long in a single cold afternoon. Within a week mice had tunneled through it in 6 places, drawn by the lanolin still thick in the unwashed fiber, and where he'd packed it wet from morning frost it had matted into a solid, useless brick that let cold through worse than the bare gap had. He sat with Voss's notebook open on his knee and read it again, slower this time, and found the line he'd skimmed past. Wash the grease out, or the mice will do your work again each spring. Tease it dry and loose as a cloud before you pack it. and pack it between 2 layers of cloth, never bare against the wood, or damp will find it and ruin it in a season. So he unpacked what he'd packed and did it again. He boiled the wool in the creek water over an open fire, 3 great kettles of it across 4 days, until the grease came off in a gray scum he skimmed with a stick. He dried it on racks he built from scrap cottonwood, turning it by hand each morning and evening for a week. He teased it apart with a pair of carding combs he traded a day's labor to a neighbor woman to borrow, working each hank of felted wool back into loose, air-shot fiber until it sat in his hands like a snowbank instead of a stone. Then he packed it, 6 inches deep this time, not 8, because Voss's notes suggested that packed too tight the fiber lost the very air pockets that made it work, between an inner layer of burlap feed sacking soaked in tallow to shed damp, and the bare cottonwood of the wall itself. He worked 12 hours a day through the last weeks of that autumn, and by the time the first hard frost came, he had finished 1 full wall of his small cabin, the north wall, the one that took the worst of the valley wind. He tested it the only way he knew how, with his own 2 hands pressed flat against the log on a night when the mercury outside had fallen to 19 degrees, first against the untreated south wall, where the cold came through the wood in minutes and ached in his palm, and then against the finished north wall, where the log stayed nearly as warm as the room itself for the better part of an hour. He did not sleep that night. He sat up with the notebook and a scrap of paper and began, in his own halting hand, a ledger of his own. Pounds of wool washed, hours of carding, inches of packed depth, which walls held and which still leaked, because Voss's notebook had taught him that a man who does not write down what worked will forget it exactly when he needs it most. Hollis Radnor rode past that winter twice, both times on his way to check cattle on the bottomland, and both times he slowed his horse at the fence line long enough to look at the strange gray batting Eli had begun tacking to the outside of his second wall, and both times he said some version of the same thing. Rags on a wall don't make a house, Corrigan, he said the second time, in December, with snow already 6 inches deep and Eli up on a ladder with his mouth full of tacks. You'll be in my barn by January begging floor space, and I'll give it to you, because I'm not a hard man. But don't tell me the blankets did anything but waste a summer. Eli took the tacks out of his mouth long enough to say, ask me again in March. By the second winter, all 4 walls were finished, and the difference was no longer something Eli had to explain to anyone who stepped inside his cabin in January and found it needed only a small fire to hold warm, where every other cabin in the valley burned wood from dawn until they slept and still woke to ice on the water bucket. He had gone through the remaining blankets and made boot liners of the same felted wool, and mittens, and a thick quilted wrap for his horse, a big gray gelding named Havoc, that he strapped over its withers on the coldest mornings, and a smaller one for the ears, because Voss's notes had a line about that too. A horse loses more heat through its ears in an hour of standing wind than a man loses through his whole body in a day. The old shepherds wrapped ears before they wrapped anything else. The old-timers in the valley, the 2 or 3 who had wintered there longest, who remembered a storm from the winter of the buffalo hunters, before the railroad, before most of the families now settled in Bitterroot had ever seen the place, began, that second autumn, to talk about cycles. Every generation or so, they said, the valley took a storm bad enough to be remembered by name. The old storm had come 31 years back. The geese that autumn had gone south nearly a month early, in numbers that blackened the sky for the better part of a morning, and had not stopped to rest on the ponds the way they always did. That third autumn, the geese went early again. Eli noticed it because his dog, an old brindle mutt named Scout who had ridden with him all the way from Missouri, would not stop pacing the fence line the week the geese passed over, ears up, hackles faintly raised at nothing anyone else could see. Eli had learned, by then, to trust the things that made an old dog nervous. He spent that whole autumn working nearly without rest, insulating his barn as he had his cabin, wrapping every strap and buckle on Havoc's harness in felted wool to keep the metal from freezing to the horse's skin, and, at the quiet urging of his neighbor Ruth Danvers, a widow with 2 young children whose husband had died felling timber the winter before and who had begun bringing him bread in exchange for an afternoon's labor on her own leaking roof, insulating a full wall of her cabin as, well, though he would take no payment for it beyond the bread already given. You didn't ask me if I wanted charity, Ruth said, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed and her breath showing white, watching him tack the last of the batting into place. "It isn't charity," Eli said. "It's arithmetic. I've got more wool than walls now." She looked at him a long moment, the way a person looks at someone they are deciding whether to trust with something larger than a wall. "My boy's taken with your notebook," she said finally. "Tobias. He's been asking after it every time you're here. He can read it whenever he likes," Eli said. "A dead man's notebook does more good open than shut." The storm came on the second week of December, in the third year, with almost no warning beyond the geese and the dog, and a sky that went the color of a 3-day bruise by mid-afternoon. It came in from the northwest at close to 50 miles an hour, driving snow so fine and hard it felt like sand thrown by a hand. And within 4 hours the temperature had fallen 31 degrees to 18 below zero, with the wind dragging the felt of it down further still. It was, by every account given afterward by every family in the valley, the worst storm to strike Bitterroot in 30 years, the storm the old-timers had been waiting for without quite saying so. Eli's cabin held. That was the plain fact of it, stated afterward the way plain facts get stated, without much drama attached. The 4 walls that had cost him a summer and a winter of labor kept the inside of his small home at a livable temperature on a single banked fire, while outside the world went to a place no unprotected structure could have survived unscathed. But the barn was not finished. He had gotten to 3 walls of 4, and the 4th, the west wall, the one that would take this wind dead on, was still bare cottonwood with the gaps unpacked, because he had run short of wool that autumn and meant to finish it in spring with a fresh clip. Havoc was in that barn. So was Scout, who had taken to sleeping there since the cold set in, curled against the horse's legs. Eli went out into it a little past midnight, when the sound of the wind against the west wall had changed from a howl to something closer to a scream. Wrapped in 3 layers of his own felted wool from boots to ears, a rope tied at his waist and lashed to the cabin door, so he would not lose his way the 11 yards to the barn in a wideout that swallowed the lantern light within 3 feet. He found the west wall had begun to fail, not collapsed, but the gaps between the unpacked logs wide enough now that snow was driving through in a fine white spray that had already begun to drift across the barn floor, and Havoc was standing rigid in the corner farthest from it, ears pinned, breathing hard, while Scout huddled against the horse's front legs, shivering in a way that had gone past shivering into something more dangerous. There was no time to pack wool properly. Eli tore the wrap from his own shoulders, the outer layer, the felted batting he'd made for himself, and packed it barehanded into the worst of the gaps, working by feel more than sight, his hands going numb within minutes despite the wool mittens Voss's notes had taught him to make. He worked for the better part of an hour, stripping layer after layer from himself and packing them into the wall until the worst of the spray had stopped and the barn's air had gone from a moving cold to a still one, which was, he knew from the notebook and from the second and third and fourth winters of living by its lessons, the difference between a barn that killed a horse and one that didn't. He carried Scout back to the cabin against his chest, inside what remained of his coat, and the old dog lived through the night, though it was a near thing, and Eli did not sleep again until the wind broke 2 days later. It was during the second day of the storm, when the worst of the wind had dropped enough for a man to move between buildings if he kept a rope on himself, that word came, carried on foot by Tobias Danvers, Ruth's boy, who was 11 that winter and had run the half-mile from his mother's place with his face wrapped in a scarf and his eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the cold. That Hollis Radnor's youngest hand, a boy of 19 out checking cattle when the storm hit, had not come back to the Radnor ranch house and had not been seen in over a day. Eli went out into what remained of the storm wearing every scrap of felted wool he owned, with Havoc wrapped in his own quilted blanket and his ears bound against the wind, and found the boy 4 hours later in a shallow coulee 2 miles from the Radnor place, alive but badly frostbitten, having wrapped himself as best he could in a horse blanket that had frozen stiff and useless around him. Eli cut the boy free of it, wrapped him instead in the dry wool he'd carried strapped across Havoc's back for exactly this possibility, and got him back to the Radnor ranch house before the second wave of the storm closed back in that evening. Hollis Radnor stood in his own doorway with his sons, his hired boys, hand nearly lost to frost, and a debt he had no words for yet, and said nothing at all that night beyond a rough thank you that cost him something to say and that Eli did not make him repeat. The valley buried 2 men that winter. An old bachelor who had lived alone 8 miles south and been found too late, and one of the Ostrander boys, caught in the open with his cattle. It could have been worse. Every family who spoke of it afterward, in the years that followed, spoke of it as the storm that should have taken more than it did, and there was no single reason for that. Only a scattering of small mercies and a few hard-won preparations, of which Eli's walls and wraps were one thread among several, not the whole cloth. 2 years passed. The valley rebuilt what the storm had damaged and moved on the way valleys do, in the slow, unhurried rhythm of seasons rather than events. Eli finished the barn's 4th wall that first spring after, and finished Ruth Danvers's 2nd and 3rd walls the spring after that, not as charity now, but as ordinary neighborly trade, the kind that didn't need a name. Tobias Danvers, 13 by then and grown a head taller, had taken to spending his after-chore hours at Eli's place more often than not, reading Voss's notebook by the window until the light failed, asking questions Eli didn't always have answers to and had to find by trying. It was Tobias who first thought to felt wool tight enough and thick enough to line the inside of a water barrel and keep it from freezing solid overnight, an idea that wasn't in Voss's notebook at all, and Eli made him write it down himself, in his own hand, in a fresh notebook Eli had bought him at the trading post that autumn for 11 cents. A man who doesn't write down what works, Eli told him, forgets it exactly when he needs it most. I didn't come up with that. I stole it from a dead man. Steal it from me the same way. Hollis Radnor's change came the way Voss's notebook had said heat moved through wet wool, slow, and mostly unseen, and real, all the same. The 3rd winter after the storm, he sent a handover with 2 of his own worn wool coats and a short, gruff note asking whether Eli's method could be done with coats as well as blankets, since he'd rather not waste good cloth if it couldn't. Eli sent back a longer answer than the question required, and heard nothing further that winter. The 4th winter, Hollis rode over himself, on a bitter January afternoon, and stood in Eli's barn a long while without saying much, running a hand along the packed west wall, the one that had nearly failed, rebuilt now stronger than any other wall on the place, before he finally said, "How many pounds of wool to do a wall my barn's size?" Eli told him. Hollis did not thank him for the information, exactly, but he took it seriously, in the way a careful man takes seriously a thing he has decided, after long observation, to no longer dismiss. By the 5th spring, Hollis Radnor had insulated 2 full outbuildings on his own land using wool sheared from his own considerable herds, wool that had previously gone to market for a modest price and now went, in part, to his own walls instead. He never made any large announcement of having changed his mind. He simply began doing the thing he had once mocked, quietly, the way most real changes of mind happen in a person who has too much pride to narrate the change out loud. That same spring, a new family arrived in the valley, the Millers, from Ohio, with young children and a wagon not much fuller than Eli's had been 5 years before, and took up the last unclaimed quarter section at the valley's south end. The father, a practical man named Curtis Miller, spent his first weeks in Bitterroot doing what any new settler did, asking questions, taking stock, deciding whom to trust. He came to Eli's place on the advice of Ruth Danvers, who by then had become, in her own quiet way, something like a second voice for the method. Her walls had held 5 winters running, and she said so plainly to anyone who asked. Curtis Miller stood in Eli's cabin, ran his hand along a wall that had by then gone 5 winters without a crack of frost showing on the inside logs, and said what Hollis had once said, though with less certainty behind it. "Blankets," he said. "You're telling me the whole of it is old blankets." "Not the blankets," Eli said. "What's inside them? Come see the barn." Hollis Radnor did himself, if you don't believe a stranger. He'll tell you the same as me, though it'll cost him something to admit he was wrong about it first. Curtis Miller did go see Hollis Radnor's barn, and came away convinced by evidence 5 winters old rather than by any single night's proof, which was, Eli thought when he heard of it, a better kind of convincing than the storm itself had ever managed. Not a miracle remembered, but a method trusted. By the 6th year, Tobias Danvers was 17, near enough a man grown, and had taken over the greater share of the insulation work across the valley's northern half. His own hands steadier now than Eli's, which had begun, in small ways Eli did not speak of, to stiffen in the cold mornings the way a man's hands do after enough winters of hard outdoor work. It was on a quiet evening in that sixth autumn, with the first frost already silvering the grass and the geese moving south in their ordinary, unhurried numbers, that Eli sat down with Tobias at the same small table where he had first read Anders Voss's 11 pages by tallow light, and handed across his own notebook, the one he had started that first winter, filled now front to back and into a second volume besides, every wall and pound and failure and fix recorded in his own hand across 6 years. "You've got your own started," Eli said, nodding at the notebook Tobias had carried under his arm, the one with the water barrel idea in it, and a dozen refinements since. "This is mine, to go with it. Voss gave me the start of a thing. What you do with the rest of it is yours to decide." Tobias took the notebook with both hands, the way a person takes something heavier than its weight. "You'll keep teaching me anyway," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "For as long as I've got hands that work," Eli said. "But a man ought to have his own book before he needs it, not after." That winter, and the winters after it, the work went on much as it had, quieter now, less urgent, the frantic proving years behind it. Havoc had gone gray-muzzled and slow, and a young horse Tobias had broken himself, a bay he called Ledger, had taken over the harder winter work between the two places. Scout had died peacefully 2 summers past, at the foot of Eli's bed, and a pup out of Ruth Danvers's own dog had taken up the old spot by the hearth, too young yet to understand what its predecessor had survived. Years after the storm that had given the valley its measure, when Eli Corrigan's own hands had grown too stiff most mornings to card wool the way he once had, it was Tobias Danvers who walked the valley in winter, checking on wool-packed walls the way a doctor checks on old patients, and Tobias Danvers to whom new families came first, with their own version of the question Hollis Radnor had once asked with such certainty that it wasn't really a question at all. "Rags on a wall don't make a house." He would tell them what he'd been told, in his own words now more than the words he'd been given, because a lesson passed down whole and unchanged was not truly understood, only repeated. And in the second notebook, the one Tobias kept himself, filled now in his own steady hand with the accumulated knowledge of 2 lifetimes laid over a third, there was a line near the last written page, added the autumn after Eli Corrigan was laid to rest in the small valley cemetery, beside his wife's stone, brought at last the long way from Missouri. Beneath it, in Tobias's own hand, the old line carried forward and turned, gently, toward the ones still to come. "Wool remembers the sheep that wore it, and it remembers the hands that shaped it. Treat both kindly, and what you shape will go on keeping others warm long after your own hands have gone still."